has moral beliefs? I'm not thinking of this in some abstract way. I'm thinking of just the everyday judgments that we make about what is good or bad or right or wrong, permissible or not, and so on, right? Stealing and murdering is wrong. Helping others in general is generally good to do. Lying, well, maybe that depends on what you're lying about or who you're lying to, right? But everyone has some moral beliefs, right? But have you ever asked why something is right or wrong? Is it because of some concern over fairness? Is it because of the harm that's done? Is it because it's against the law? If you've ever watched Animaniacs, I'm dating myself here, but there was this character named Mindy, and I think that was her name. She would go around and ask all these adults, right, the question why, to the point of absurdity, right? But that's the line of questioning I'm thinking of here, right? Like, murder is wrong. Well, why? Because it hurts others. Well, why is it wrong to hurt others? Because we should care about others' well-being. Well, why should I care about others' well-being? And so on, right? This is a central question that is being addressed in ethical theories, right? Or what I want to call, well, what's often called theoretical ethics, right? It's the attempt to get at the heart of what makes something right or wrong, right? The nature of rightness and wrongness, good and bad. Okay. Now, you might think this line of inquiry is a fascinating abstract exercise, but that it has no import for what you do on a day-to-day on your day-to-day lives, right? Because let's be honest, like before you even explore ethical theories, you have your own moral beliefs. As I just said, right? You have moral beliefs. You make moral judgments for all kinds of reasons in the way that you do. But I think it'd be a mistake to just set aside ethical theories wholesale, right? The truth is that humans are great at making up justifications for what they do, right? We create justifications out of thin air, right? And those justifications are rarely, if ever, consistent. They're not. We say whatever we need to ourselves in order to justify whatever it is that we want to justify in that moment. We could care less if we're being hypocritical. Some people care more than others, but in general, I mean, again, like a lot of this is without our even knowing it, we create these justifications to, in some sense, protect ourselves, right? We say that lying is wrong when we are negatively impacted by it, but justify our own lying if it serves our needs, appealing to maybe some exception to the rule or something like that. We say others should follow all these seemingly pointless rules, but are quick to find a way to justify our own breaking of the rules by either diminishing the impact or the authority that the rule has. You know, I do this, honestly, I do this every time I'm speeding on the roads, right? So I justify it to myself. It's like, yeah, everyone else is speeding. This is perfectly fine. And then when it's like when a cop pulls me over for speeding, then I'm abhorred by the fact that they would even pull me over. Right? It's like, how dare you, like, for speeding, right? As long as it was safe, right? It doesn't matter whether or not I was speeding, right? Okay, look, sidetracked. Given that we have this bias in our own favor, it is even more important, I think, for us to reflect on the ways our biases infect our moral judgments. And theories here, I think, serve as a wonderful guiding light. It's a way of practicing consistency in our beliefs, right? Regardless of which ethical theory you hold to be true, right? Whichever one you're drawn to or have a leaning towards, right? It doesn't matter to me, right? One of the things I think is really helpful about at least exploring these theories and talking about what kind of reasons we have for adopting the theory versus not, right? The reason I think these theories are so helpful is that one of the things that theories do is it enforces a degree of certainty in how you justify your moral beliefs, because they need to be justified in the way that the theory dictates, right? Should be justified. And so your actions then should be a reflection of this sort of consistency, right? For instance, it's hard for me to eat meat from a grocery store if the moral theory I hold claims that any sort of unnecessary harm to any sentient being is wrong. Right? Let's say like utilitarianism is an example of this, right? Knowing that most, if not all, the meat at the grocery store involves some degree of unnecessary harm to animals in the process of meat production, I would be a hypocrite. I would be violating this theory and, in some sense, my own moral judgment then, right? I would have some degree of inconsistency here if I were to then eat meat from grocery stores, right? And so this is just a simple way of kind of saying, look, what are these theories kind of trying to do? Well, one thing it's trying to do is trying to get at the nature of rightness and wrongness. But the other thing that it actually ends up doing is that it forces us to at least have consistent justification for the moral beliefs that we come to hold. And then what that at least helps us do is to keep ourselves in check, right? It helps us keep ourselves in check. It prevents us from just making up whatever reason that we want to justify whatever we feel like in the given moment. In fact, not only do we have to justify it to ourselves and be consistent internally, right? But other people can now then point to that sort of inconsistency. Other people can see, like, hey, you hold these sets of, principles based off of this theory, and you seem to be violating it, not just in terms of beliefs that you hold, but in terms of the actual practices that you engage in. You seem to be violating it. And that sort of inconsistency should keep us in check and prevent us from just, you know, making up justifications for whatever we feel like justifying. Okay. There's, however, also an additional reason, I think, for valuing ethical theories. Look, many times people come to disagree on what is the right thing to do, right? I mean, I don't have to tell you, you've probably had moral disagreements with other people on for all kinds of reasons, right? Sometimes the disagreement is grounded in some difference in belief about what is the case, right? Like sometimes we disagree on, let's say, whether or not, I don't know, animals can feel pain, to a certain degree, like based off of the neuroscience. You might hold a belief that's true. I might maybe hold a false belief because I misunderstood the neurology of animals or something like that, right? Okay, so sometimes the disagreement is just because somebody holds like false, maybe both people hold false beliefs, right? Uh, and so as a result, you might disagree about what's the best course of action to take. Other times, though, there's a much deeper and a moral disagreement at the in the works, right? Something much more fundamental, like a difference in principle, right? About what we believe is right or wrong, about what makes something right or wrong, right? And here's the thing. If we don't have explicit discussions in identifying not only what we believe to be right or wrong and why it is that it's right or wrong, and other people share what they believe and their justification for believing something is right or wrong, if we don't actually have that exchange, we might not ever get to realize that sometimes there's just a much more fundamental disagreement about what we value or what we take to be the guiding principle for what makes something right or wrong. Some of us value consequences over anything else. And so, as a result, it makes sense then from that perspective that you'd be willing to do certain heinous, sometimes what people might call unjust or unfair acts in order to create the best possible outcome, right? But others don't value consequences in that way. In fact, others might value integrity far more, even at the cost of horrific consequences, right? Some value individual rights even to the cost of collective needs. But others might value collective needs much more than they do individual rights. And so they're willing to violate some individual rights in order to protect the collective. These types of differences are genuine moral disagreements, and rooted in them are disagreements about which moral principles should take precedent over others. These are theoretical, in many ways, theoretical differences. These are differences about and beliefs about what makes something right or wrong. So one of the benefits of actually talking about ethical theories is that not only does it give you some consistency internally, right? But it also gives us the language and a way of making sense of disagreements so that we at least have the starting point of a meaningful discussion where we can actually know what it is that we're actually disagreeing about. And if we have different core values, that's going to say a lot about what we can or maybe cannot do to bridge the gap that exists between us. Like some of this, unfortunately, might just be a non-starter, but at least if we acknowledge that there's some core difference in value that is leading us in different directions in our moral judgments, and that these are, not differences in values that we can resolve in any way, at least not through rational arguments, then one of the benefits then would be that you would stop trying to do some rational arguing for or against certain positions. It would just be a waste of time and energy. Now, there are other ways of convincing people. These are ways that we go about convincing people through like relationships, through rhetoric, through, I don't know, through something else, but it's not going to be through rational discourse, right? But at least you know that it's not going to be resolved in such a simple way that you can't convince the other person otherwise if there's a much more fundamental disagreement in value. So at the end of the day, these theories are going to do a lot to help us bring to light some of the differences that we have, some of the inconsistencies we have in our own beliefs and our own actions. And it's going to provide us with helpful language that allows us to make better sense of our own moral views and the views of others, and to be able to engage in meaningful discourse between, amongst ourselves, right? And hold ourselves and other people accountable for violating the very principles that we claim to live by. And I think all of these things would be a great thing for all of us to be able to do. In the least, at least, I think we would, face less frustration trying to, you know, trying to do something that will bear no fruit, and instead focusing our attention on, the kind of discourse that will actually bring about some enlightenment, bring about real change, again, in ourselves or in others.